Welcome, thanks for coming and joining us this afternoon. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose land we meet today, the Wurundjeri, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge the Barkandji people and the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, whose land Darling Darling was actually filmed on. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from all nations of this land. So my name's Shelley McSpedden. I am a curator and I had a huge privilege of working with Gabriella Hirst on her work Darling Darling, which hopefully you've all had a chance to look at down on the ground level in Gallery 3. If you haven't, please make your way down there straight after this. It's a really fantastic work. And it's been a real privilege to work with Gabriella on it. And I'm really excited to introduce this panel of incredible women. It was International Women's Day recently, so it seems appropriate, who bring some really interesting perspectives to how we might think about Darling Darling and a lot of the ideas that are raised in the work. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Gabriella Hirst. It's great to have you here, Gabriella. Gabriella is usually based in Europe, and getting her to Australia in our recent times has been an epic effort, but it's really fabulous to have her here to see it. So Gabriella is a multidisciplinary artist, and her work really engages with wildly different subjects and contexts, but I think it always comes back to this question of a representation of our engagement with the natural world and what that tells us about our political, cultural, social sort of structures and histories. And I think throughout her practice, she's also really drawn to romanticism and some of the kind of absurd or alarming realities that lurk behind these kind of romantic visions that have been produced throughout sort of Western history. I'd also then like to introduce Vanessa Kowalski, who is a painting conservator at the Grimwade Conservation Service that's part of Melbourne University. Vanessa works with the conservation treatment of a whole range of sort of paintings from both the Western tradition, but also Australian Indigenous painting. And that's actually a real particular interest of hers and her practice. And finally, I'd like to introduce Zena Cumpston, who is a Barkandji woman and is currently a research fellow at the University of Melbourne. Her work really centres around Aboriginal perspectives on biodiversity, and she's recently released a free ebook that explores Aboriginal plant use. She also works as a writer and a consultant and is currently curating an exhibition which sounds absolutely wonderful called ACMI Sky, which is a collaboration with the Science Gallery of Melbourne and will open in the Old Quad in midway through this year. So look out for that, make sure you go and see it. So first off, I'm going to get Gabriella to tell us a little bit about this project and give us an overview about what brought her to this subject. In Darling Darling, she makes these incredible connections between the work, the kind of ecological crisis facing the Barka Darling River system and the work of conservators at the Art Gallery of New South Wales on a colonial era painting by WC Piguenit, called The Flood of the Darling, 1890. And so it's a painting of that same region that she's exploring this ecological crisis in. So could you tell us a little bit about how this came about, how these kind of connections you're making kind of first came to you?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Zena and Vanessa, for joining. So Darling Darling, I guess in general, it's been a long time in the making, and it's interesting to think back about like where a work came from, and I'm going back in my head now like quite a few years. But I guess I think a lot of artists would also have this same thing where you're just always picking up different instances, different kind of encounters that you have, and putting them in the vault, and then at some point down the track they sort of click with other things, and there's some like potential knowledge to be discovered with from that. And one of those encounters for me was the first time that I went to Barkandji country, which I think was 2014. I was completely a visitor. I grew up in Sydney, and I was driving between Broken Hill and Menindee, and I saw some signage on the road on this street that it was very nostalgic. It was in this very 1950s style font with these images of pelicans, and this is, for me, I didn't understand that this area was also a river system because I'd just seen the desert side of it, and it said "Welcome to the Sunset Strip," and so we drove down this road that was lined by trees, and my memory of this first time to the Sunset Strip, which I came back to again and again, was of this kind of incongruousness where suddenly, seemingly in the middle of a semi-arid region, there was boats on their side, there was signage of birds, there was these houses that kind of had this European-style chalet roofs and poplar trees and lawns that were green and watered. And so all these kind of things to lead to the expectation that we were about to arrive at this lush lake. And then, of course, at the end of the drive, after this tennis court and this sandy beach, there was just this vision of the Menindee Lake, empty as far as the eye can see. And it was, for me, that kind of like going through that facade of this seemingly bucolic surface, kind of image, promise, and then to come across the Menindee Lakes, which, as Zena and I were talking about earlier, they are subject to changing river flows and changing water flows, but through the manipulation and mismanagement of these waters have been drained again and again in really damaging ways for many years. So that was kind of one of those encounters. And then I moved to London and I studied in London. And at some time towards the end of my studies, I've always been interested in conservation practices and kind of mining the mechanisms behind how one might experience art in a gallery. And I was researching, I don't know how, in an internet hole, I found this little YouTube video that had been put out by the Art Gallery of New South Wales that was like a quite cheesy Talking Heads documentary about the conservation and restoration of this painting. That I know this painting because I grew up in Sydney and I'd always visited this gallery. It'd been a big part of my kind of foundational education about art. And it kind of showed the care processes behind the restoration of this particular painting. And it also showed kind of the funding models behind it. It had a talking head of someone from the Bank of America Merrill Lynch. It was, and it just, I don't know, it just triggered something that I know this area. And it is, of course, the same river system. And it's all Barkandji country, this area that is, called the Lower Darling region. And kind of, I guess those were the two key crystallizing moments of making this work.
And so what do you specifically also, obviously landscape painting and the Australian kind of colonial tradition of landscape painting is hugely, important to the work. What drove you to that specifically?
I used to paint in my undergraduate days. I painted and I remember with my painting class, we went to places like Hill End, and there was this, sort of bravado I always felt uncomfortable with about the idea of going into the bush and painting. And I couldn't really figure out what that was because it's also very seductive, and I love painting. I'm very seduced by it. But there was something that made me quite uncomfortable about this idea of just like a kind of abandon into a place, particularly if you're an urban-based artist. And I guess that kind of led me to thinking about, particularly once I did move to Europe, to thinking about romantic landscape traditions. I was living in Germany, so particularly like romantic German landscape traditions, this Caspar David Friedrich idea of like an individual standing in front of a vast phenomena, whether that be a vast kind of quote-unquote wilderness, that could be like the Baltic Sea or the Swiss Alps, and this kind of curious hubris of trying to contain something so vast as a storm into a relatively small rectangle, pictorially, and what that might mean. And I worked on this work, Force Majeure, which was showed in Melbourne a few years ago, and that was kind of a turning point of trying to figure out like how to understand that romantic tradition. And then I started to consider what it means to implant that romanticism and that romantic approach of capture onto somewhere like so-called Australia. And I kept thinking about what it means for someone to stand, like it's one thing if someone's standing in front of the Baltic Sea and claiming it to be empty despite God. But what that means when that is in somewhere in so-called Australia, and it's a painting being made as part of the pastoral project of invading inland Australia. And it just has these undertones of terra nullius and claiming. So I started thinking about one part of painting being constituent to dispossession. I mean, there are many other stories around painting, and this is just, for me, it's just one of the contradictions that I'm trying to work through as an image maker. And thinking about the camera as an extension of that too. So yeah, sorry, it's a very wordy, extended answer.
No, and I think those that idea of capture and containment and possession are really relevant for all, for conversations that we can have. And we might just follow up. Before we do that, I did want to kind of come to this idea of care, because care is the work in itself is really a big meditation on what it is to care for something and what it is to be a custodian for something. And obviously that is something that relates to all the work that all of you do. So it's sort of a concept that I really want to kind of tease out. I think when we're thinking about care, it's really hard when we look at the work not to be shocked by, it's interesting with your depiction of the Barka Darling and its ecological crisis. In some senses they're quite seductive images because they're done with a kind of romantic touch, but obviously the devastation that they're depicting is quite evident. Maybe we could just start by talking about, as an outsider, what were your observations of that landscape when you came in, and then I might get others to join in this discussion around this.
So yes, as I've said, I was very much a repeated visitor to this area, and coming into this country, the Barkandji country, and I guess thinking about my pointing a camera at the river and capturing it again as being in a way. Like thinking about my own complicities. I always struggle with that word, considering I say it quite a lot. With this painting tradition of capture, through the lens of the camera and through the frame of the camera. So I was coming in there, and I was thinking about all those things, but I was just so lucky to have the chance to. Well, I was working with a wonderful crew, but also to have a lot of conversations with people who live along the Barka Darling, who are from the Barka Darling, and whose stories of how they are trying to save their river, how they are fighting for their river, despite just being continually abandoned and let down by those who have the power to stop that happening, and the power not to continue to perpetuate that, but who continue to just chase short-term profits instead. One of my key collaborators through this project, I was incredibly lucky to be guided by Barkandji elder Uncle Badger Bates, who is an artist and an activist, an educator, and was guided on where to film, but also where not to film. And in terms of what I saw of the river, I mean, I think a lot of people have seen the pictures from 2019 when there were the fish kills that really brought to light one of the kind of symptoms of this vast mismanagement of this river that's been happening since invasion, but I guess in most recent years, one of the most damaging forces causing the crisis at the river is large-scale water theft from upstream. It's really important to note that, of course, whilst climate change is exacerbating what's happening, it's an exacerbation of damage to the river that is being caused by large-scale water theft is a huge contributing factor, and corruption and mismanagement in general. And one of the sites that Uncle Badger Bates, when I told him about kind of this place that I'd seen, he was like, make sure that you film that. And I think it'll come up at some point, but it's one of the shots that shows the mussels in the river. And the mussels, what I learned was that the mussels gather in the deepest parts of the river, the parts of the river that should never go dry. And because they're slow-moving creatures, they accumulate there. And you'll see they're all exposed and they're all dying. And that is indicative of the fact that this is not just a regular flow. And I was told this should never happen. This drying up of this particular spot, this deep part in the river, should never happen. And so, when you film, make sure that you film those mussels, because people need to know this is not just that old story of like flowing climate change flowing regular changes of the river. This is something that is caused. Yeah. I have a message that I wanted to read out from Uncle Badger Bates, who was going to be here, but unfortunately couldn't be here. So Uncle Badger Bates says, please pay attention and listen to everyone who lives on the Barka Darling River, and listen to Barkandji voices. Please support the listing of the Menindee Lakes under the Ramsar Convention on International Wetlands for protection of wetlands of international significance. And here I quote directly: "The Darling Barka must flow like the blood in our bodies. All rivers must flow like the blood in our veins."
Zena, I might bring you into the conversation there, because obviously there's this sort of, I guess, a tension between different, managed land water management systems, between a kind of Western tradition and a First Nations kind of, knowledges and traditions. So I wonder if you could speak a little to those differences and how you think they're impacting the region, those kind of contrasting modes of care or relationship to country or land.
Yeah, I want to start just by acknowledging that we're on Bunurong and Wurundjeri land, and give my respect to elders and thank their ancestors for keeping me safe on country. I'm a visitor here too, so yeah, I'm a Barkandji woman, but I didn't grow up on country, so I have to be really careful about my cultural authority and what I can talk about. So I guess a lot of us here have watched what's happened over time on our Barka, our Darling River, as observers. And I guess even though I'm a Barkandji woman in many ways, because I haven't grown up where my family is, I've also been an observer. But I guess the thing that I really feel the most about those different ways of knowing and those different modes of care is that we, as Aboriginal people, no matter where we are custodians of our country. So many of us, like me, don't live on country, but I still have my responsibilities. So as much as I can, I try and include anything that I can about what's happening on my Barka, and be a part of conversations wherever possible as well as supporting mob whenever I can to tell their stories too. But I guess, the biggest difference in that, the way in which we view and interact with country is that the Barka's our mother. She's literally our mother. So this happening is people having to watch someone being degraded, being disrespected, and being tortured in front of our eyes. And for my cousins and family members who live in Menindee and Broken Hill, it's been really devastating, at a whole different level to what I've been exposed to, because all of my Menindee family for a long time haven't had drinking water. And people are getting really sick, actually. I lost one of my cousins who only in his 50s with Alzheimer's-like disease that, I feel that a lot of the things that have been happening to my family health-wise are to do with the devastation of our Barka as well, because it's the algae that's come is incredibly poisonous to everyone. It actually stinks. And if you look at, for example, Uncle Badger's submission to the Royal Commission in Adelaide, which I think was 2019, you can just Google it, Badger Bates Royal Commission, Murray-Darling Basin. The changes that have happened over time have been absolutely horrific. The water used to be pretty much clear. Everyone could drink. Everyone could get a feed. it was a major part of our social lives as Barkandji people, but also our cultural responsibilities. So to be so helpless to see this happening when there's nothing that can be done is devastating. And I think the thing that's missing, and obviously there's a lot of people who care, but the thing that's really missing in the dominant sort of Australian culture is that the custodianship just kind of isn't there. And I see a lot of the time that people are quite distraught about what's happening, but I don't think that they have the level of understanding that it's all of our responsibility. Like, what are we going to do? Because it's just happening over there. And I feel it's affected Barkandji people way more than anyone else, even though I have a lot of respect for the farmers and people who've lived on that country for a long time.
Yeah.
It's a different level of care that's expected of us. Without the river, as Uncle Badger says, we're not anything, because we're Barkandji, Barka, Kinji, we're people of the river.
Yeah.
And it's never too late as well to sort things out. But when you look deeply into what's happened, especially over the last sort of 13 years since the Water Act was passed in 2007, it's hard not to give up hope.
Yeah. Yeah, that idea of being kind of embedded and having this profoundly reciprocal relationship with the land and with the waterways. So we're completely connected seems to be key to what you're talking about. I think, like, you know, after the fires that happened in Australia in 2019 and 2020, which were completely devastating, and I think a real wake-up call for a lot of people around what's, you know, the ecological crisis we're facing became very tangible, I think, for a lot of people. And I think around that time there was a lot of discourse or like thinking about Indigenous, you know, fire management systems and things like that. And maybe there is the beginning of a shift to a kind of turning to looking at the Indigenous knowledge systems and management systems. What do you think, what are the key lessons we need to learn? Is it about that, how, you know, custodianship and our kind of the way we view the land and the waterways and the natural world?
To me, I see it as kind of intrinsically linked to like our society's care of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in general. Mm-hmm. While we still have so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people dying in custody, like I think 3 last week, this is interlinked. It's about respect and understanding and people who've got more skin in the game. And when I see what's happening in the wider context of us as Aboriginal people and the way we're perceived and respected in society in Australia, I see that lack of care is a massive problem. So I wonder, do people think that we should just stop getting ourselves into prison? Like, how is it that nothing's been done about this huge problem? Like, even since that Royal Commission, none of those recommendations put forward have been put in place. And I wonder the same, like when I think about my Barka and the cries that go unanswered, I just think that there's like a massive level of care that's just really foundationally rotten. And it goes across everything in our society. We're so obsessed with, you know, being part of a capitalist system that actually everyone at every level of care, people who work in nursing homes, daycare centres, all the people who are doing the most for all of us in terms of care are respected the least. And their work is valued the least. And it goes across so many levels of our society, but it's starting to affect all of us, because when you extend that to the environment, you know, we as Aboriginal people know that if you look after country will look after you. But it doesn't seem to be kind of seeping into the greater discourse around the way we manage things. And I think there's also an understanding that, you know, we as Aboriginal people, having been here for such a long time, do have very nuanced and important knowledge about how to care for, you know, specific areas. But at the same time, we also can't reverse engineer what's been happening. So I wonder if there's like an over estimation, but we haven't been included and it's something that hasn't been tried, and what's been happening for the last 200 years is not working. And we're kind of hurtling towards something that is really, truly, you know, terrifying. So I personally can't see any way that incorporating us into systems of management cannot be beneficial. And even, on my country, Uncle Badger speaks so much, from a place of so much more understanding than what I have. But I know for years and years and years he's been fighting and working on different boards to try and get people to understand how the Barka can be served by, instilling Aboriginal values and knowledge that we have about the way that the water should move and what should happen, but just goes completely, it's just ignored. And at the moment, all the talk about cultural flows is really problematic, because cultural flows actually has the capacity, if it was put in place properly, to make a huge difference to the devastation that has, been the circumstance of the last 10 years or so. But the cultural flows would have to come from cutting down on irrigation. So the chances that that will happen are, extremely slim. So I definitely think that if we, as a society, could find a way to care more for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, then I think that we would see that would translate into the environment and things being done in a way where the people who've got the most skin in the game have some power as well. Because on my country, we've got native title, but we don't have any water rights at all. So look what's happened on our country, and yet we have rights.
Yeah.
It's without water rights, which cultural flows would give us, proper legislated rights, and that water would have to be released.
So I might just ask you, could you just explain just briefly what cultural flows is, just in case people aren't familiar with that kind of concept?
Yeah, so the only way that people have included in the discourse ways that Aboriginal people could have control over water is through this concept of cultural flows, which means that it's an amount of water that means that people can have their cultural, spiritual and economic needs met. So I think a lot of people don't understand that we as Aboriginal people also need to have a say and have some power in the economy. So there's this idea that we can only have water if it's for our cultural needs, but actually we should have rights to water the same as everyone else does, so that we can develop our own commercial interests also. But when we're talking about cultural flows, we're mainly talking about spiritual, cultural and economic wealth, and Aboriginal people holding legislated rights to own water, which obviously doesn't fit with our modus, but more than happy to take that ownership idea if it means we can look after country, which is every living thing that's in it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I guess something that is interesting about the way that, or the connections you make in Darling, Gabriella, is that you do show our capacity to care, and a lot of that care that you show and highlight is through the conservation processes that you observed at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And you had a really amazing experience of working with the conservators there, both the painting and frame conservators, Andrea Nottage and Paula Dredge and Barbara Dabarara? Yeah, okay. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience and what you observed of them as custodians for the objects that they were looking after?
Yeah. So I've been in conversations with Paula in particular pretty much since I started thinking about this project in 2018. I guess the work is set up in a way that can be read as an opposition of care, that a care and a lack of care from one side to another. And I think that's a provocative thing to think about, and I think that's fine that that's there, but I see the work as being much more nuanced in the way that it thinks about care, and hopefully the space is there to bring in different ideas. And some of the conversations that I had with conservator, those two I mix up, Paula, was about that, about how to think about the labour that goes into tending to an object like a painting. And it's interesting what you were saying before, Zena, about how maintenance work is just, in general, in society, is just not given as much support as it should be. And that is something that I did think about in this, that in thinking about art conservation as also as this kind of hidden work that is so often not it so often happens behind the scenes of the gallery. It's so often something that happens and that labour isn't shown to a regular visitor to a gallery, except for here at ACMI, where they've now made this like glass wall so everyone can see the restoration work. So my personal interest in this field was in thinking about a painting by Velasquez called The Venus of Rokeby that is in the National Gallery in London. And it's of a picture of a nude woman. And in 1914, the suffragette Emily Richardson went into the gallery and in protest of the treatment of Emmeline Pankhurst, went and slashed the painting. And I thought that was really interesting in what that meant for that kind of particular object, of what it meant about the containment of a female body, and how the discourse around that was being, that painting became a witness of a change in women's rights in London, or parts of an idea of a change of women's rights. But then that painting was meticulously restored. And when I went to London, I expected, because I've been fascinated with that story for a while, I expected there to be some signage that talked about that work, that how this painting had been a witness to that particular event. And there was nothing there. There was nothing on the wall that said anything about that. And the only way that you could see that restoration job had happened, because it was so well done, was if you got down, which is something that I learned from Andrea at the gallery, was to go down to the side of the painting and to see the light glancing off it, and to see this scar, this very subtle scar on the painting. And so it started me thinking about why is this labour hidden? Why is this labour happening behind closed doors? And it shows kind of the power, I guess, of these paintings and these images being kept telling a certain story, telling a story that is Velasquez's vision, as opposed to kind of a collaborative effort with the slashing that Emily Richardson did. And I spoke with Paula and Andrea about this, and about kind of what does it mean to be a caretaker of a painting? What does it mean to restore that painting, to keep it telling a particular narrative as opposed to another one? And the key thing that I learnt from my conversations was that painting, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that in the past techniques around conservation and restoration were much more invasive, and they were much more about even changing a painting to see fit to the way that there was some very kind of brutal, heavy-handed efforts. But now it's much more a scientific treatment that is not, it's about caretaking that work, and everything that you do can be reversed, and everything that you do is about making sure that you don't damage what's underneath. And this kind of more complex understanding that I gained through this made me kind of think about painting conversation in a different way.
Yeah, Vanessa, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's about preserving or retaining the artist's intention. So by removing a discoloured varnish that might obscure the reading of the painting, alter the colour values or the tonality of the painting, it changes how you view the work, and it changes your reading of it. And so by leaving a painting that's been torn or damaged in that way, it changes the story of the work, or the context of the work outside of what the artist probably intended. So we are, as a conservator, in terms of our approach to care, our role is to ensure that we minimise, we're restoring works for future generations. So we are minimising change or degradation, physical and chemical, that might cause loss of information. And we're doing that, all of our actions are governed by our respect for the history of the object, the aesthetic, the physical object, and the cultural identity of that object.
It feels like there's got to be a lot of interpretation there on your part in like making a decision about how you intervene and when you intervene and, you know, the intentions of the artist. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's, I mean, every artwork is approached as an individual piece, and it depends on the materials. It can also depend if the artist is still alive, if it's an Aboriginal artist, when we're working in Australia, and that idea that, yeah, how you would approach something and what is the most appropriate way to approach something and intervene, and what type of materials that we would use to do that. So, yeah, it's a dialogue between conservators but also artists or artist representatives when possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Also thinking about an object as a living entity, you know, something that's evolving and changing through time is kind of interesting. I think one of the things that becomes really apparent in this work and relates to all of the facets that it touches on is this idea of, or there's a tension in the work between a kind of a desire to impose stillness and to fix something in time and to kind of close it off or contain it, and a kind of and then a kind of the natural movement of time and life and, you know, material objects and ecosystems and this kind of dynamism that is in the world, you know, and I think that relates to the work that all of you are doing. Yeah, I mean, how do you see that? I guess we'll start with the conservation. Like, how do you see that playing out in your role? This kind of, you know, I think in some ways you could think of conservation as a desire to kind of arrest time.
It can depend on the type of object. So certainly with paintings, there's much more this idea that you contain it and you keep it as it was originally presented. With other types of artefacts, like ethnographic objects, for example, or you know, at the Shrine of Remembrance, there's a room with the regimental colours in it. So sometimes it's not always appropriate to contain that change in the object and the materiality of the object. So with the regimental colours, part of what those objects are is that they are supposed to degrade, and that is not supposed to be stopped or reversed. So that as they degrade, that's part of the meaning of those objects. And similarly with ethnographic objects, it might be that parts of the object like soot or dirt becomes part of the history of the object, and so you would not change that or remove it because that, you know, it's a different type of object to an easel painting. So yeah, it's a different approach depending on what you're working on and depending on who the custodians are as well. That can play a role in how you might approach a conservation treatment.
Yeah. Interesting. Zena, I think when we're thinking about the Barka Darling region, you know, it is a region that has historically goes through cycles, you know, very extreme environmental cycles. And I think, you know, thinking about sort of the way of, you know, Western traditions of land and water management tend to kind of ignore those cycles or try to contain them or control them in some ways. And it seems to me a primary difference, you know, with different knowledge systems, it seems like Indigenous knowledge systems seem to acknowledge those changes and work with them. Do you think that that's a fair observation, or how do you think that works? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, the reason why we've been here for so long, and I know people hear it all the time, but you have to really take it in, like, we're the oldest living culture in the world, and, you know, we continue to practice our culture today. The only way that you can have that circumstance is to constantly be changing and to be so interconnected with the world around you that as the world around you changes, you can adapt yourself to those changes. And that's how we've managed to live through ice ages and things that in other parts of the world haven't been possible for the mobs, you know, there. And I think that adaptation and that knowledge of country is something that we still practice. And yet, you know, today, as we adapt, we're seen as inauthentic. But we've always done things our own way, and we've always changed over time. We're not stuck in the past. Things are still evolving in terms of our culture, and we're allowed to have new things as well and new ways of being. Like when I'm talking about the economy as well, like we don't want to do anything that's degrading country, but we also have to be a part of the economy, which means that we have to, you know, perhaps be involved in farming practices that are a bit different to our own, or are an extension of things that we've been doing in the past that look very different to the outside world. But I think, that adaptation's core to every part of our culture and our ability to survive and to thrive. And I think that as well, when we're talking about coming together with Indigenous knowledge systems and non-Indigenous knowledge systems, there will be new realms made if we manage to sort of come together. At the moment, I work sort of in science, and I see that a lot of the time people are wanting to incorporate Indigenous knowledge in a way that's just a really nice, easy sprinkling on the top. So it's almost like to garnish their beautiful machine, but actually we have our own beautiful machine, and there are ways that we can come together, but it's not with one knowledge system being dominant and the other being seen as a garnish. And you really see that in the bush foods industry, which drives me quite insane, because, these systems of agricultural management and scientific understandings of plants, so that we've been able to get everything that we have needed for the longest time imaginable from plants, from technologies, medicines, nutrition, anything you can think of, we've worked out how to do it from plants. And it's just amazing to me that gets boiled down to like wattle seed scone recipe. And you just think, like, how can such a complex system of understanding come down to bush tucker? And I don't knock anyone who's in that industry, and especially not mobs who are managing to be the 1% that's making any money in a $20 million industry that's actually all seems to be for non-Aboriginal people if you look at the stats. I think there's so much for us to discover if we can find some more equal ground, and that is empowering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to lead. And I think that's the big thing that's missing at the moment, that ability to lead projects. If Barkandji mob were in charge of cultural flows and all the mobs along the Darling system had some legislative rights to water, there's no way that what's happening now would be happening. But I think it's overwhelming for everyone, and I think it's hard to there's so much in the news that we almost can't take it in anymore. But I just read a book this week by Richard Beasley called Dead in the Water, which I'd recommend to anyone. It's got just the right amount of hilarity mixed in with the absolute terror of what's happened with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. But it's actually a really cracking read, and it really breaks things down. He was one of the solicitors who worked in the Royal Commission in Adelaide. But there was lots of things that I didn't know properly about what's happened. And I was already really angry, and now I'm like catatonic with rage after reading that book, because I actually can't believe that we're all letting it happen, and we are, all of us. But if you do want to be more educated about what's happening and the bastardry that's gone on, because a lot of people like to think this is drought and climate change. It is absolutely not drought and climate change. And all of the plans that they have in place at the moment do not use any of the climate science. There's with what's happening now, that is just unforgivable, that they are not using climate science in any of their projections. And in any of the numbers that they're talking about in terms of the water that needs to go back into the system. So, I think it's like $20 if you buy it as an ebook. It's really worth reading, and I feel very empowered having read it, because I thought that I understood a lot, and now I understood a lot more about what's happened, and can see like what Uncle Badger's saying about how perhaps the Ramsar might be the only way, because throughout time we have often only gained rights and that level of care from the society that we live in as Indigenous peoples through their embarrassment in an international system. So it's actually some of the treaties that we've had to sign that are the only thing that's keeping any level of care in the Murray-Darling system. So I think that, it's really good for everyone to learn a lot more, and I really recommend that book if people have time to read it, because it's a real eye-opener, and it somehow is hilarious as well, which is
that sounds like a marvellously amazing combination. Gabriella, maybe you could talk a little bit about these tensions between containment and leakiness that you're exploring in the work, and how they kind of play out for you.
It's interesting thinking what you were saying earlier, Zena, about how that water rights are not included. That the actual water itself is not included within the being able to kind of control your own country and being able to have rights, but the actual water itself is missing. And I think that's a really key thing. And it just adds to, I've learned a lot and I've been thinking a lot about how water functions in this country and how water is contained in this country. And I've been like looking at kind of, looking at these particular painters in the 1800s who would pictorially contain water and who would go out and simply by actually like depicting water as a still thing with oil on canvas. There's a degree of claiming and ownership and placing a certain stasis on a body of water that is actually something that exists in flux, and thinking of the kind of ethics and politics behind that and what it means to actually like still something that, like, particularly I think early on in this research, Shelley passed me an essay by J. Arthur that talks about how water in Australia is so often a dynamic force that is constantly changing. And so, to think about the politics of holding that water still as an act of claiming and control and dispossession. And then I guess also to think about, in terms of thinking about conservation, to think about one thing that I learned from Paula was that one of the reasons that painting restorations need to happen is, and one of the key reasons is because paintings all have varnishes, and the varnish layer is really tough and brittle, whereas the layers underneath, particularly the canvas layer, is softer. And then the layers in between, if you think about it kind of as stratas with a cross-section. I believe there's an image that comes up which I found which really demonstrated this for me. The pigments that were used in Piguenit's painting all have these names like English red or Prussian blue, these names of European cities, or these names of minerals that are extracted from the ground, like titanium white. But underneath that, there is this soft layer. And one of the reasons why restorations need to happen is because whilst there's all this climate control in galleries like Art Gallery of New South Wales, one of the things that's really hard to manage is the humidity. And the humidity in the air, which I guess thinking about like ideas like the hyper-sea, this idea that like bodies of water cannot be just contained and stilled in one thing, that they're always in flow and they're always moving through us as living beings that are made up of water, and that a body of water is not static like in a painting. But that same water in the air will cause these kind of, like in this picture, will cause the kind of cracking and the movement and the flow. And so thinking about a painting as a kind of, as holding tributaries underneath it, as holding kind of artesian basins underneath it, and that body of water will crack a painting and become dynamic in its own way. And that's been a way that I've been thinking about water having agency to break down these colonial paintings. It's a gesture in thinking about that. But then also thinking about restoring that layer on top as a way of damming that body of water. And that's one of the ways that I've been thinking through leakiness. And of course, the work itself, if you've seen it, you'll know it functions on leakiness, on sound leakage, that there are these two screens that hold images on one side and on the other side, but the sound itself leaks from one screen to another, and it performs this kind of leakage between the two. So I guess the work is, in a way, it's a way of scrutinizing various different ways of looking at water and various different ways of looking at how water can have agency and how we can kind of seek to highlight that agency. And I don't know what that will do, but perhaps it will try and break down very set archival categories, perhaps a little.
Empowered by the water. Okay, we've only got a short bit of time left, so I'm going to just finish off on a kind of top discussion about authorship and collaboration. Piguenit's work is very much the classic kind of Western hero artist going off into the wilderness and bringing home a sublime image for his audience. Gabriella, this project was the first time that you worked with a full film crew. So you had this very collaborative experience in making this work, which is obviously a very different model. And I think those ideas of sort of, the master, solo master versus the sort of collaborator, collective effort are evident in the work itself. So could you tell us a little bit about that experience of collaboration and what that's kind of brought to you as an artist in your practice? And then I'll open it up to some questions to you around those ideas as well, Zena and Vanessa.
Yeah, I mean, ideas of breaking down authorship are, I'm interested in that. And there's an image that will come up, which is of Piguenit's Flood of the Darling with all of the marks that Andrea Nottage did. And I like to kind of think of that image that then I rephotographed, and to think of it as like a collaborative effort between like William Charles Piguenit, Andrea Nottage, and myself. Which Andrea is like, why? But yeah, and also I guess like, I don't know, in my thoughts on conservation, thinking about like, that painting at the National Gallery of Velázquez, Rokeby Venus, is a collaboration between Velázquez, a team of Mary Richardson slashing that painting, the team of the unnamed arts workers who constantly maintain that work and keep it there, and that like there is this idea that a single name must be tied to a work. That said, if you go downstairs, you'll see Gabriella Hirst, Darling Darling. So I'm being kind of contradictory.
There's been a long list of collaborators.
There's been a long list of collaborators, and this work. I mean, all works are collaborative, but this work and this opportunity of getting this, this lump of cash to make this work. Thank you. Has meant that I can work with this incredible team of people, like Bridget Eichen, who produced the work, two incredible cinematographers, Justine Kerrigan and Meg White, Dan Mao, who did the sound recording, Justine Muller, who is an incredible artist and who's worked with Uncle Badger Bates, and like this kind of effort of us all working together to make these images. Liam Egan, who did the most incredible sound work, and really importantly, Sam Smith, who's an incredible artist who sat with me and did the grading and the editing together. And that all of these people, and yourself, and like so many people who have worked on this piece together with me, and also of course Paula, Basha, and Andrea, who have made this work together. And it's crazy that you would just have a single name attached to it, and yet I have. So I probably need to work on that. Figure out actually. Oh, and sorry.
Sorry, go on.
You'll notice that there is a gold SD card which holds the film, and that's in the gallery space. It's a very small detail, but that holds Darling Darling on it, a copy of Darling Darling on it, and that's been gilded by Basha, the frames conservator at Archive of New South Wales, as our kind of little gesture to, breaking down,
the convergence,
like working together.
Yeah. Great. Vanessa, can I just get your thoughts on that idea as the conservator? What are you? Are you a collaborator? Are you a co-author? How do you picture that?
I mean, that's interesting to hear your thoughts about collaboration, and that, even just that overlay of Andrea's notes on the painting and the condition of the painting, and then you photograph that being a collaboration. That's really interesting. And, conservation can be such a lone, especially with paintings, you just working as a solo person on the work, but we do collaborate a lot, and often a lot of contemporary artists will contact us to ask us about materials and their suitability to a type of work, because we have such an in-depth understanding about materials and their degradation and their compatibility. So we do collaborate. Not really, maybe it's more advice. It could be seen as a collaboration though, I suppose. And then when it comes to the actual restoration and treatments, we do collaborate. I mentioned briefly before that we do work with artists or artist estates when possible and when required, and certainly we work with Indigenous artists if we need to intervene in a work, so about what they would consider appropriate in terms of approach and the materials that we'd be using. So there is a sense of collaboration there. And in terms of authorship, I don't see the work that we're doing as taking ownership or authorship, changing who the author is or adding to the author of the painting, because we are using materials that are reversible, and we are trying to do the most minimal intervention as possible. And a lot of it's about an approach about preservation, so reducing any work that we might need to do anyway. So
Yeah, they seem like valuable lessons for how we might think about our relationship to the environment as well, you know.
Yeah.
Zena, I guess finally just that idea of collaboration and a kind of collective effort. It seems with what you were talking about earlier, this need for us to think collaboratively, for all of us to take on sort of, you know, responsibility for addressing these issues. Do you think a kind of more collaborative, collective vision is what's called for to kind of face some of the ecological challenges we're up against?
Yeah, I definitely see that, you know, we're all in this together because we are. Some of us are up against it a bit more than others. But I think the more that we can work out how to work together, and that's something that Uncle Badger's really, really big on. He's always bringing people in. He's one of the most generous people I've ever met in my life. And a lot of us Barkandji mob are like that, and a lot of Aboriginal people in general are very generous. And I think there's a willingness to come together to sort out some of these things, but I think that there's some fundamental structural problems, like I was talking about before, about what's seen as like an add-on and what's the foundation that needs a bit of shaking up. And I think all the things that are happening in our society at the moment are a really good sign. We've all had enough of the privilege that's, you know, been so damaging to so many of us. But definitely it's like, I think great if we can all think about our individual responsibility, because so often in our society we see things as, oh, that's the government or that's someone else's business, but it's not. We are the government, and what we put up with is what's going to flow from here on in. So, yeah, especially like with understanding more about how we can be really good allies for people who really need it. It's about educating ourselves. I see so often people, especially in my workplace, are expecting me to educate them. And there's a big problem with that because, you know, if we can't individually take our responsibility to understand what's happening and why, it's just exhausting for people who are going through stuff that's not fair or right to have to be the one that kind of tells everyone what to do. And you know, on that note, like I would say, we as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people can't, like I said, you know, reverse engineer what's been going on. But if we're given positions that allow us to have power, like, you know, being given native title and also being able to have rights to water, things are going to be better for everyone, because when you get it right by us, it generally works for everyone, but it doesn't work the other way around. Getting it right for non-Aboriginal people never works for Aboriginal people. So I think there's hopefully some big changes afoot, and I'm hopeful for the future.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for your time today. You've been fantastic, and it's really wonderful to hear your thoughts on these very wide-ranging topics. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining us as well.